With the rise in coronavirus cases across states and businesses scaling back reopening plans, Americans' jobs still remain highly uncertain in the near term. This makes the prospect of meeting expenses highly fragile, including meeting one of the biggest ones, rent.
The Urban Institute recently found that about 20% of all renter households had at least one household member lose a job between February and April of this year. This struggle to pay rent has fueled an existing eviction crisis. And according to the ACLU, black women have had evictions filed against them by landlords at double the rate of white renters pre-pandemic.
So what can be done to ensure that vulnerable populations are protected and provided access to affordable housing with a pandemic in the backdrop that has only exacerbated their financial situations? I sat down with Dr. Ben Carson, U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, to find out. Take a look. Secretary, great to have you with me today. Thanks for joining. I want to start with some metrics here. Researchers from Columbia University estimate that homelessness could increase by between 40 to 45% this year. What is your plan to ensure that that does not happen?
Well, since this whole thing started, we've been extremely active, very quickly moving out to issue a moratorium on evictions, on foreclosures, establishing a forbearance procedure, all of which is designed to make sure that while people are concerned about their health, the health of their families, that they're not losing their homes. So that's why we have things like the rent recertification program. For instance, if your income has markedly decreased or disappeared and you're getting government subsidies for your rent, you can be recertified so that you're not penalized for that, and there is money that is part of the CARES Act to take care of that.
Well, speaking of the CARES Act, things like federal eviction protection ends July 25th, along with other unemployment benefits from that act. Currently, there is no clear plan for a replacement. So what do you recommend the federal government continues to provide as we're seeing COVID cases rise across the U.S. and Americans do remain out of work?
Well, last week we announced the issuance of our toolkit, specially designed to prevent evictions and to help people to be able to connect to the various resources that exist. We have, for instance, the cfpb.gov/housing site, which gives information from both FHA, FHFA, and the Consumer Protection Bureau in terms of what things are available, in terms of the counseling that can be received. And we have information for both the renters and for the landlords so that they can enter into agreements, payment agreements. So a lot of the landlords are not aware that they can actually benefit from the PPP. And so we make sure that they know that, and we make sure that the tenants know that as well, so that that information can be disseminated.
I do want to also have you help me understand some of the challenges that people already face, during this pandemic. The existence of, say, previous or prior eviction filings can keep tenants out of housing opportunities for years, which obviously makes it harder for vulnerable populations like Black communities to overcome housing hurdles. What should be done to get these kinds of vulnerable populations out of this housing cycle, not just now during this pandemic, but going forward into the future?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things that the president asked the council to do, the Opportunity and Revitalization Council to do, is to refocus some energy on those communities that were hardest hit by COVID, with much more morbidity and mortality. And of course, everybody immediately says, yeah, well, it's because they have more hypertension and diabetes and obesity and asthma and all these other things, which is true. And those things do need to be focused on. But you really have to go the next layer down and ask the question, why are these things more prevalent in these communities? And that has to do with the housing conditions in which people live, the work conditions that people have to endure, the fact that they don't have long-term medical care issues, the fact that, and this is the really big one, that educational opportunities are limited. And I always say you can take anybody from any circumstance, no matter how desperate it is, and you give them a good education, and they will become successful in our society. And we really need to put a lot more emphasis on school choice and making those options available to people.
So, Secretary, it sounds like you're putting a lot of the weight on education and schooling, but that is yet another thing that is of question right now. A lot of debate on how and when, what protocols there will be when schools reopen, whether it's universities all the way down to even daycare facilities. So how do you kind of reconcile those two things where there is this emphasis on education, but that is yet another thing that is so unknown at this point?
Well, first of all, you have to have the right attitude. The attitude is not if we're going to make education available. The question is, how do we make education available? How do we do that in a safe and effective way, not whether we're going to do it? And there's really no evidence that children are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19. Um, and what we really have to start doing is teaching our young people that even though you're not likely to get it, you should assume that you're an asymptomatic carrier. And if you're an asymptomatic carrier, teach them how they should interact with older, vulnerable people. That will do a lot for our society very quickly.
Secretary, I do want to ask you, looking back over the past few years, what are you most proud of accomplishing during the Trump administration so far?
Well, there's been a lot of accomplishments. I would say go to HUD.gov and look under the accomplishment section. You'll be blown away because you never hear about the good stuff. But one of the things that really disturbed me when I came here, other than the fact that it took 5 months for me to get one single assistant secretary and 8 months to get a deputy sec, was the fact that there were no financial controls. And so there had not been a CFO for almost a decade. Can you imagine the billions of dollars that flow through here and no CFO? So we brought that in. We have established tremendous financial responsibility now. And the whole organization has changed very significantly as a result of that. And that has a domino effect on many of the other aspects of what goes on here.
That was the current Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Dr. Ben Carson.